con panelistas de todo el mundo y de toda la región latinoamericana, donde vamos a abordar temas de litigio, derechos humanos, género, participación, y es algo que vamos a estar repitiendo, al menos antes de las conferencias de cambio climático en los próximos 2 años. Y son talleres totalmente gratuitos que se enfocarán pues en estos temas claves y pues en actualizarles a ustedes, a todas y todas, sobre el tema de daños y pérdidas y cómo exigir justicia. Nuestro objetivo es poder empoderarles a la sociedad civil, a los y las activistas de Latinoamérica, para que amplíen su conocimiento, para que puedan incidir de una manera más efectiva en estos temas relacionados con derechos humanos, con las finanzas, perspectiva de género, desde un enfoque de justicia y pues en relación con el cambio climático. Bueno, mi nombre es Adrián Martínez, soy el director de la Ruta del Clima, somos una ONG líder en América Latina en lo que tiene que ver con cambio climático, en incidencia política, en participación, y posicionando las necesidades y por las perspectivas políticas de la región en el tema climático. Y estamos trabajando con varias organizaciones, y pueden ver los logos en el lanzamiento del taller, que no quiero empezar a mencionar todas, pero se me queda a una, pero es un esfuerzo colectivo de diferentes organizaciones de la región y redes, para traer a sus expertos y expertas a estos talleres y puedes compartir, y entonces ahí van a estar viendo diferentes personas de diferentes organizaciones para poder dar esa pluralidad de perspectivas y opiniones. Nos acompaña hoy, para dar inicio a este taller, una de nuestras socias, Sabine Mininger. Ella es asesora de política climático para la agencia Broad Food y Wealth o Pan para el Mundo. Ella trabaja y ellos trabajan en el tema de cambio climático y justicia ya por bastante tiempo y tiene un enfoque bastante sólido. También tiene un conocimiento bastante detallado sobre la Convención Marco de Cambio Climático y pues también colaborando con organizaciones del Sur Global. Tiene una carrera bastante amplia en el tema, digamos, de cooperación, sobre resiliencia, y enfoca su trabajo principalmente en lo que es la justicia climática, la adaptación, el financiamiento, y pues ahora trabaja y ha trabajado con nosotros como una socia, una aliada en el tema de daños y pérdidas y la búsqueda de justicia. Entonces ahora voy a cambiar a inglés, y por favor recuerden utilizar la función de traducción en la parte de abajo. Thank you, Sabine, for joining us. So I gave a very long introduction to you. We're extremely happy that you joined. And we're very happy and very thankful for Bread for the World for joining us in this yearly series of talks that we'll have at least for the next 3 years before the climate conferences. And so it's just to explain to you the logic. We'll have you give a presentation, then we'll have an open floor where people can use the Q&A, the question app that Zoom has, or the chat, and I'll be then collecting the questions that we get, and we'll have this exchange, and then we'll have just a closure of the event. So thank you again, and there you go, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for the kind introduction. I also got a little bit of it. And I'm also happy to present myself. Now I'm Sabine, and I worked in around 60 countries worldwide on climate issues and visited partner organizations and their projects. I've come around, and I also work with our partner organizations like La Ruta del Clima, who is a very important lobby partner, but also project partner of Bread for the World, working on the front line of climate change. This is also like what partners of us are doing in the Pacific, for example, or in Bangladesh, or in Ethiopia, where I've visited them. And then you will also see some pictures now in my presentation that I have taken at when I visited partner organizations or colleagues of mine for Bread for the World. So I was asked today to give a presentation about loss and damage in the context of UNFCCC, or put it in the context also of loss and damage. I'm happy to do this, and I will share my screen now with you. So now So I believe that you can all see it now. Adrian will tell me if not. And so I guess you can see now my presentation. Forgive me that I have two screens. So I will go look now in this direction so that I can see my own presentation while I'm speaking. No. Okay, I have a, so that is how it's working. So we are all exposed to climate change, but we are not all at the same risk yet. As you can see here from this map about climate risks, which was developed by Bread for the World in a collaboration consortium with many other organizations, you can see that also industrialized countries and countries in the global north are impacted by climate change. Very badly, for example, Australia by droughts, but also the United States of America are not safe from climate change. But we see that there is a lack of capacities that lead to increased risk. That means if you have no coping capacities to deal with climate risk, then that is putting you at a risk because you cannot recover, you cannot rehabilitate, and you cannot adapt to changing climate change. And that is very clear here. The sentence is written in Germany, sorry, but it says lack of coping capacities. And that means you do not have the financial means, you do not have the medical means, and also depending what kind of government you have in place, who's able to deal with disasters in an appropriate way, that makes the big difference how to deal with climate change impacts. And there we see clearly it's the countries in the global south who are most at risk of climate change because they lack the coping capacities. And yes, we have the same problems worldwide. And also Germany is not safe from climate change. We had a terrible flood here in one region, only one weather event that costed Germany 40 billion euros. That was what we call the disaster from the Valley R, which is south of Bonn, that Adrian might note from the climate negotiations that are taking place there in Bonn, the former capital of Germany. And the same year or shortly after, there was the flood in 1 year after the floods in Pakistan, where 3/4 of the country was devastated by the floods impacted, and with a total bill of 30 billion US dollar. So we see that, that we have all the same problems, but again, Germany can deal with this problem by themselves. They do not need help from outside. And the money was, of course, provided to build up the country, the region again. So I don't want to bore you out now with numbers, but I found here from the Red Cross International report, it's a bit older, from 2019 or 2020. The numbers kind of interesting as well, because also humanitarian aid is stating that we have an increased weather-related disasters by 35% over the past 30 years. So it's not only climate science that is telling us that we have more and intense and a higher frequency of weather extreme events, but also humanitarian aid, who are those who are dealing with weather extreme events. So climate risk have a tremendous impact on the poorest countries, and particularly on the least developed countries and the small island development states. They are particularly impacted by the negative impacts of climate change because of their lower capacities to adapt to climate change, their poorer access to capital markets and investment, and lost assets. And it will increase existing problems. For example, their fight against combating poverty and hunger is now at stake. And they are punished, and that is really, really unfair, these countries have not the possibilities to do own investments in their countries to adapt to climate change, because they're punished at the capital markets for being climate vulnerable. That means they have to pay higher interest rates to get investments, for example, building dikes or dams, than other countries who are not climate vulnerable. Another very negative impact from climate risk is that we see with increasing climate change that will also lead that certain areas are inhabitable. And this is a picture from Tuvalu that I have taken from the year 2008. That was the last time that I visited the main capital of Tuvalu. This is Funafuti. And you can see here in the middle, maybe you see my cursor here, this is the airport. And this is basically already the entire population, and some more on other islands. And this is the government building here. And a country like Tuvalu is only 1.5 meters above sea level rise. And it means that in the long term, not in the long term, actually in the midterm time, they cannot stay there, and they will definitely relocate to another country when their island is so flooded that they cannot live there anymore. And it will happen due to sea level rise. Also, intense storms are already a very, very big threat to them. And the World Bank predicts that with increasing climate change, we will have 260 million people by 2050 who have to migrate within the region. So there are also other numbers, but you do not know, can people actually migrate? Yeah, can they actually flee, or are they actually are they trapped where they are? Trapped populations are in a very dangerous place that they cannot leave anymore because they're, for example, surrounded by floods, or there will be borders who are hindering them to go to a safe place. So, but in fact, that there is a very high number of people so badly impacted by climate change that there would be a need to leave the place where they are. And speaking about numbers, that is also a topic where we as NGOs found it very difficult. We take our numbers from United Nations Environmental Program or from UNEP, we also take them from the World Bank. We also take them from insurances, who are very good in calculating the costs of climate-induced loss and damages in the past, and also make predictions for the future, because that's their business case. But I just give you one number that by 2030, it's approximately between 300 and 600 billion US dollar on costs in developing countries alone, only in developing countries. So, and then by 2050, if we go on the climate path that we have now, so going towards a global temperature increase on 2.7 degrees, plus 2.7 degrees, then we will probably have costs facing around like 1 trillion US dollar. And these are numbers that no one can really get anymore. So it just tells us something. Whatever the number and the cost will be, it is by far more expensive than protecting the climate. Climate protection, mitigation of greenhouse gases is the cheapest that we can do. Dealing with climate-induced loss and damages is the most expensive way, and actually the unaffordable way that we are going now. And guess which part we are taking at the moment? We go for the most expensive, for the most unpredictable, and the most unaffordable way that you can just imagine. So our world leaders seem not to understand what we are doing here in like purely an economic way. So, and countries like Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they will take over an extra $1 trillion debt over the next 10 years if there is no adequate loss and damage finance or adaptation finance in place. So, and the public debt has already increased in so many countries in the global south. 108 out of 116 countries are already in serious debt, and 45 are in a very crucial debt situation. So, because they are taking all the money that they have to deal with climate change, and climate change became so expensive that the federal budget that they had for, let's say, education or women empowerment and all this, or medical support, all these very important topics, there's all the pots and the funds are not cannibalized by climate change. We make a difference if it comes to loss and damage. We speak about climate-related slow onset and rapid events. So these are the two climate risks that we are facing. The slow onsets are those who go over years, and we can also see the impacts, and they are irreversible. So that means the melting glaciers combined with the sea level rise and also desertification is something that will not go back anymore. That will move on, slow but certainly. And then we talk about rapid events. Rapid events are weather extreme events, and you can actually rehabilitate when it's gone. So when it's over, you can deal with it. You can build up the country or the region again. We speak about droughts, floods, storms, for example. These are typical rapid weather extreme events related to climate change. So in droughts, for example, in Ethiopia, that we know from Ethiopia, many other parts of the world, and became very, very extreme. And therefore, they are counted as weather extreme events. And a typical slow onset event is the melting glaciers, for example, in Peru. And on your continent, you are facing all different types of slow onset and rapid events that are existing, like in Latin America, and especially also in your region. So, and the melting glaciers in Peru, you can see here, this is a picture that German Watch was so kindly to give it to me. Here is the glacier, and actually here it is already melted so badly, and it's the only freshwater source that they have there for farming. And this farmer, Saul, has gone to court in Germany, and he sued the German power provider RWE for destroying his village, because his village is below the glacier lake, and it's very likely that his village will be flooded soon. And he's suing, he made a legal case that the German energy provider should compensate his village for the loss of the village. So far, he was not successful, but especially the climate litigation cases, they are now growing and coming up in all fora, such also like Vanuatu, who went also to court. Then we make a difference between climate-related economic loss and damage. And these are economic loss and damages are those damages that have a price tag. So we speak about the damage of infrastructure, buildings, housing, loss of crops, for example, loss of crop yields, and there the harvest that is gone. So there we have a clear price tag, where you can ask for this amount also for compensation. And then we speak about climate-related non-economic loss and damage. And these are losses that are highly tragic and very terrible for the people, but who have not a price tag. And still, it has a very high value. So the loss of human lives, the loss of your home, the loss of your nationality, your identity, culture, language, whatever you're leaving behind when you, for example, have to flee your country or relocate to another country. So I met the schoolgirls here in Tuvalu, And these brave girls, they told me they will never ever leave Tuvalu. They will stay in Tuvalu and they will never become a refugee in other countries. They rather die. That's what they said in the age of 13. I'm sure if worse comes worse, they probably change their mind and will relocate with their families to another country. But they told me that they are so deeply rooted in the Tuvaluan culture with their land. They're so connected and spiritual connected to their land that they cannot imagine that there will be a Tuvalu 2 or Tuvalu B in another country. And it was very heartbreaking to talk to them, to understand their motivation why they would never leave their country. And now we come to the part, what are the world leaders doing now to ease the pain, to help the people, to provide support to those who are already impacted by climate-induced loss and damage. It's just a matter of time that we are all impacted by loss and damage. So it's a matter just of time how bad it will hit all of us. But at the moment, it's the poorest and the most vulnerable people who are impacted most. So, and that was the loss and damage has a long history, over 30 years, but I think I will very quickly give a quick and dirty where it is discussed, the support of the poorest people, and these discussions are taking place with world leaders in the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, which is a baby of the Earth Summit in 1992, where it was clear we need a framework convention on climate change to reduce the threat of climate change. So we have a problem, we have to solve it, and we have to solve it all together as the United Nations. So, and 169 member states are a part of it, and annually there is the conference of the party, what you know as the climate summit. So once a year it's rotating from continent to continent, and in 2 years it will be on the Latin American continent, the South American continent. It will take place probably in Brazil. At least Lula lifted his hand and said that he would like to host that in 2 years. This year the summit will take place in Dubai, and last year it was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It has also a secretariat, and that is in Bonn, Germany. And loss and damage has a longer history than actually the United Framework Convention on Climate Change exists, because we had now our 27th summit in Egypt, and everyone there who has been around for a long time fighting for loss and damage was speaking about over 30 years. They all said, we were fighting, our fight was over 30 years. And I will explain you why. This here is a tweet from our friend Alpha Kaloga. He is one of the lead negotiators from the African group. And Alpha put out that tweet on the 19th November in a very historic moment where he said, 30 years of patience, the day has arrived. Now we have a fund for loss and damage. Yeah, and the history goes back. I will not bore you now with all details, but I thought I give you a very detailed presentation that you can read, and you can also have it later. But it started already the discussions in the year 1991 in the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee that prepared the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that funded then launched the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So already in this international negotiating committee, loss and damage was already discussed. But at the end, there was only discussions about having an insurance pool to compensate small island development states. So there was just a general reference at the end in Article 4.8 of the convention. So, But still, it was there. It was already discussed, and it came up all the time and all the time. 10 years later, it was reiterated that there is a problem. And then also in 2007, it came up again in a Bali action plan that we need disaster risk reduction strategy and means to address loss and damage. So climate finance to address loss and damages. And again, it came up 2010 in a work program on loss and damage, where like meetings were held throughout 2012 on assessing and addressing loss and damage, like 13 years back. And then at the COP, and I was already involved there. From 2009, 2008, I was taking part in the COPs. At every COP I was part with, and I saw how the topic came up again and again and again. And then finally, a very historic breakthrough was then finally there when in 2013, the Warsaw International Mechanism was launched, it was established, and to address, especially to address and to minimize and to the avert impacts of climate change. And that was still, sorry that I say that, it's highly appreciated that we have this working group, but still it was politically on a very weak place, the Warsaw Mechanism. So they put it like just as a working group that gives suggestions. That's it, cannot decide, but can give suggestions. So, and then finally, and that was already then the next very hard fighting step that the poorest countries together with civil societies then made as a success that came out of the Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, it was possible to mention loss and damage. Now you can speculate, but I was there 2 weeks, and in the discussions before, it was clear that industrialized countries will never accept a single item on loss and damage. They always want to have that loss and damage under adaptation to make sure that there will not be a claim for additional funding. So they said clearly, and I was in the room there always and reiterated it, only loss and damage under adaptation, not next to it. At the end, the poorest countries, especially the small island development states, Marshall Islands, they were very strong on that, said, no, we need a standalone item on loss and damage. And that was probably the reason why the entire Paris Agreement has no headlines anymore. It has numbers. So to make sure that there is not a headline on loss and damage, it's ridiculous, I know. But that was probably because of loss and damage. That's like what we all got, that is a compromise. Okay, you get an Article 8 that speaks about loss and damage, but the headline cannot be less than loss and damage. Then you see how paranoid industrialized countries have been about it, so scared that there could be claims on finance in the future. And yes, there were claims. And the US was then even more paranoid than all other industrialized countries. They said that even Article 8 cannot be a basic for liability or compensation claims. And they wanted to have a para 51 included in the Paris Agreement, saying, okay, we can speak about loss and damage, but not about compensation. And now we want to sign you a legally binding international treaty where you step back from any compensation claims. Of course, that didn't fly. The Marshall Islands made very clear that this para will disappear from the Paris Agreement, but it made it into the decision text. The decision text is not a legally binding document, but still humiliating enough that it was clear the US will never pay. So that's what they made clear, even without legal binding, that has no legal binding obligations, but still it had to be set and it has to be there and it needed to be signed and recognized by everyone. So that was the end of Paris. And now I move on to the massive breakthrough at the last conference of the parties, the COP27 in Egypt, because in the meantime, many things have happened, but I kept it short. I wanted to jump now directly to the big happening. And I'm sure the next climate talks that you have now with La Ruta and Clima, they will go into the details. I won't do that. I just give you now a quick and dirty overview what has happened, that industrialized countries at the end caved in and they allowed it happen that we can speak about finance for loss and damage. A thing that they even tried with ridiculous legal clauses to avoid. Finally, it was possible. And it was possible because the global north gave up their blocking against the topping. It was possible that because of the unity of the G77 in China, all developing countries, they stood strong behind this call of action, especially the alliance of the small island states. They were very, very strong on that. And it happened that the COP president asked Germany and Chile for their guidance as co-facilitators to find an agreement. And that was probably also a smart move. So that brought also Germany, as a member of the European Union, under pressure to deliver on this. And yeah, and then of course there was also like a thing that is not predictable. We had simply a massive increase in loss and damages, and they were visible and painful in the world media. And we also and also climate science told us clearly, a clear language, what we are dealing with. So it was nothing that you could turn a blind eye on it. So, and yet the constellation after the midterm elections in the US, they were also very helpful and gave it a real push. And the first day was already a very successful day, because speaking about financing for loss and damage made it on the agenda for negotiations. Something that was blocked over 30 years, finally, directly at the first day, there was a good negotiating environment for loss and damage. And you could see there was a clear, strong boost coming now from developing countries, that they realized, wow, our call for action now, it can come true. We go for this now. So, and yeah, again, the US said, okay, we can talk about funding, but it has to be at least outspoken here once, that again, claims for liability and compensation cannot be done. So, and it was set out there, there was a verbal note on it. There's no meaning at all, but I think it was necessary for them to continue then the negotiations, and however you call it, the funding provided, if it's liability or compensation. I mean, there are big legal differences on this there, don't get me wrong, but at the end it was possible then at least to speak about finance. So, and it was clear, this topic, we are not going away from Sharm el-Sheikh without having a loss and damage fund. That was very clear, the entire negotiations. And then, yes, it was very bumpy, but at the end, it was decided to have a loss and to operationalize a fund, and also an architecture, a financial architecture for loss and damage. So the one is the fund, and then they will also have like a mosaic of different funding pots that they want to look into until the end of 2020. Through the details have to be then negotiated by a transitional committee, and you will have someone speaking about the transitional committee in your next meeting, so I will skip that one. Yeah. What else was agreed? The Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage wanted to have like a stronger position, stronger governance. That was the position of developing countries, but there was no agreement on it. Unfortunately, the industrialized countries wanted to see it with a weaker governance body, and the negotiations on the Santiago network on loss and damage, which will be like the technical body that is dealing with technical questions, giving technical advice, that was now finally established with a strong secretariat and a strong advisory body as requested by the Global South. Again, for 30 years, all needs of developing countries were always pushed off the negotiation table. And in this year, in the negotiations of loss and damage, we had one success after the other. So the Santiago network on loss and damage is established, and it was also a hard fight, but at the end, at least it was possible to ensure that there is a reference to human rights, which is important. Yeah, if you're speaking about loss and damage. If there would be time, I would also speak about human rights, but I'm sure you can invite someone who's doing this better than I do. And yeah, and also already there, while we were in Sharm el-Sheikh, there were already several pledges made by the Global North that is addressing loss and damage, but it was not additional funding to the commitments that rich countries have done before. So they made pledges for loss and damage, but in fact, it was money that they claim as adaptation funds, and that is impossible. We need loss and damage funding now from innovative finance sources that are additional to commitments rich countries have already made, because otherwise loss and damage is so expensive it will cannibalize all existing pots, such as humanitarian aid or commitments to climate finance for adaptation and mitigation, and also for development assistance. So therefore, it's important that we see and recognize, yes, there were already some pledges, but the finance was not additional, and it was all related to the global risk sheet, an initiative of the 20 most vulnerable countries supported by the G7. And unfortunately, I found it in the entire strategy there of negotiating loss and damage very, very insensitive that which countries pushed so hard for the global risk shield, which is for itself an initiative which you can maybe criticize, but also has some good parts. It's about supporting existing risk pools, but also insurance schemes. So, and while risk pools are very important, insurance schemes are also part of it, that you might want to have a deeper look in it. But in general, it was seen as a very bad thing, and also as a distraction from the negotiations on loss and damage finance. And that is because developing countries do not trust industrialized countries anymore. There was a big lack of trust, and they thought now they give us insurances that we have to pay ourselves instead of providing climate finance for loss and damage. And that was wrong. At the end, industrialized countries agreed to the loss and damage fund. So, and to wrap it up now is we saw again a massive fight between Global North and Global South. At the end, the Global South won that fight. We all together lost the fight on reducing greenhouse emissions, because at the end of this COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, we went out with a loss and damage fund. Big success, very big success, but there was not possible to get an agreement on the exit of fossil fuels. And that is a big tragedy. So if you want to know the details, how at the last 48 hours of Sharm el-Sheikh, they were like very crucial and very exciting. It's like watching a crime in a cinema, but we were part of the crime. A civil society, so we're pushing very hard for a standalone loss and damage fund. And there were loads of proposals on the table that were not flying at all, and industrialized countries tried until the last minute to avoid a loss and damage fund, until they realized that the G77 plus China will stand so strong and they will not leave Sharm el-Sheikh without that fund. And then Germany took a lead within the European Union and came up with a proposal that also the US, that put the US very much under pressure to join, and so they did, and that was then at the end the proposal that made it then into the decision text, so that they could all agree on it. There was unfortunately no agreement on who pays into the fund and who will receive the fund. That is now a question in this year that the transitional committee that is meeting 3 times this year at least has to solve. And I must say, that's my personal take. I'm sure Adrian might have another take on that. I think industrialized countries are in the first row of responsibility to pay into this loss and damage fund. And that is because of their historical responsibility to climate change. But I also see, and that is now probably where we fall apart in our position, but within civil society also, but I see also that oil exporting rich countries like Saudi Arabia or the next host of the COP28, United Arab Emirates, cannot hide any longer from their responsibility and claim that they are developing countries and not paying into the damage in a pot that is fighting and compensate the damages that they are also causing. So we need a broader donor base, and beside industrialized countries, also other polluting countries, high polluting countries and oil exporting developing countries should pay into this. And also China played a very, very difficult role in this, because they said as they will not, as the country with the highest pollution, not per head, but per state, they said they will not pay in, but they want to receive funds. And that is also not possible. At the end, they stepped back and they became a bit more silent. So we hope that they understand that they will not receive funds to compensate loss and damages that they are mainly causing. So therefore, I will finish now and say thank you very much for listening to me. And now we have 15 minutes left for discussions. I'm very much looking forward for your questions and hope that it was not too boring for you. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Sabine. So I want to give the chance by making a very interesting question that I have for you, for our colleagues to also use the Q&A function on the Zoom, and so we can also make a space where people can get their doubts out and maybe even have some comments. But I guess you ended up with the most conflicting sort of point. And I'm right now in South America for a conference, and yesterday we were talking with colleagues from different countries here that are oil producers and that are either middle income countries. And of course this is a very sensitive issue, because I guess from their perspective, and I say theirs because I'm from Costa Rica, a Central American country, and we have no oil exploitation, and we have no real mining, and we don't really have a big industry sector, and our carbon footprint is very low. But climate impacts are very high, which is a very situation that is a bit distinct with industrialized countries in South America. But one of their arguments that it's very different, I guess, their position in terms to countries like maybe South Arabia Saudita, South Arabia, I forgot how to say it, that are like Middle Eastern countries with a lot of money and that have profited a lot, is that there's a huge debt that certain countries in the global south have, and that, for example, in a country like Argentina that exports oil, I mean, they have a huge poverty line compared to many Europeans and Middle Eastern countries. Saudi Arabia, thank you, is at this. And this is a big thing that differentiates maybe some of these global south that countries that are industrialized, that also export, but that have humongous debts to the global north mostly, and that have huge socioeconomic challenges. So to them, that is something that has to be considered. But then there is also the other question, and I would love to have you comment on the fact that if we open and that discussion on Annex 1 and Annex 2, that is this differentiation of who should pay for, how can we trust that after we expand the donor base, the global north donors actually donate? Because they don't. So they have not fulfilled their obligations or their commitment on the 100 billion, and the whole Paris Agreement was built on this idea that they would provide finance, and they have not. So what is your opinion on this sort of discussion?
Thank you, Adrian. I want to share with you that I had a meeting with the upcoming COP president, Sultan Al Jaber from the United Arab Emirates. And he will be the COP president of the next COP in Dubai. And he was in Berlin, and he said very clearly that on our call, if he would pay into the loss and damage fund, and he said, yeah, we can discuss everything after industrialized countries have paid their Paris bill. And so far, I must say, that is a deadly argument for industrialized countries, because it's true. Industrialized countries have to pay the 100 billion annually. Otherwise, they will not build up pressure on oil exporting and emerging economies who are in a position to do so. We are not talking about countries who are extracting fossils, who are not in a position to do so. We are speaking only, that is the Paris language. If you read the Paris Agreement carefully, there is clearly written industrialized countries have to provide climate finance, and other countries are invited who are in the position to do so. So speaking about countries who are rich enough. And I see also that there is like a very, or let's frame it like this, if industrialized countries would finally pay their Paris bill and their promise, fulfill the promises they have made in Paris, then it would put them in a position also to do an outreach and put pressure on other rich oil exporting developing countries to engage and commit to climate finance. As long as this is not done, I also doubt that there would be an interest to provide climate finance, because there is not, it's just the lack of credibility that industrialized countries are leaving there. So out of the 100 billion, only 83 billion are paid for the year 2020. 17 billion are not paid yet. And now I'm scared that rich countries become very creative in looking into their budget, what they can all double or triple count also on climate commitments. So I'm scared that they are not closing the finance bill, but actually start to cheat, that they are cheating and making up their commitments, which is not really, which would not be like really correct. So we see already that most of the climate finance provided, nearly half of it is not federal funding, or is not in form of grants, but of loans. And you are absolutely right. They have to pay their Paris bill. Otherwise, it looks very bad to find and to broaden the donor base for loss and damage finance. But loss and damage finance also needs new innovative finance sources according to the polluter pays principle. Otherwise, we will not be possible to deal with this massive costs that are coming up there.
Thank you, Sabine. And that's a very good point. I think we have to see the commitments paid to renew trust, and then maybe that discussion between big economies can take place into if the donor base is broadened. We have a question from Linda Riva Palacio. It says, good morning. Thanks for the very clear talk. Do you think that China should accept to pay the damages in the next COP or may accept to pay?
The first thing is that China should definitely step back from claims to get access to this loss and damage fund. I see also that we should not distinguish now in a way that only small island development states get funding or only least developed countries. Of course, all developing countries who are collapsing, who are in need, have to have access to this fund. Yeah, I mean, a country like Pakistan would not fall under any of these indicators, but if 3/4 of the country is underwater, it clearly needs help, and it clearly needs not help, but someone has to pay the cost, and that is what the loss and damage fund is there. It's not a fund of solidarity, it's a fund of responsibility. But China is the country with the highest pollutions, and is also like, it is not an incentive for China then to reduce their emissions. I think as an incentive to make clear, look, the way you are damaging the atmosphere, it will also cost you, yeah? And we, in the world community, the little funding that will be available cannot be there to compensate China, because then none of the other countries will get any funding anymore. So my question is clearly answered. No, China cannot have access. But I think your question is more, should it pay? Yeah, I think also it should pay, even though that is more difficult to answer than any industrialized country and also any oil exporting rich country like Saudi Arabia, because we see there is a lot of poverty also inside China.
So we have 2 minutes for one final questions before I have to close, because our interpreter has to go home. So there's a question about that is related to the particularly vulnerable countries restriction that is in the loss and damage decision. So what is your take on that? And also that's from, well, an anonymous attendee, but from Carlos Aguilar, he's making the point that it's also important to address the market, the logic and the model of development that is causing loss and damage, that it's something that also should lead us to discuss on human rights and obligations, that it cannot just be about finding sources of finance, but also regarding to the actual causes, that is the economic model. So if you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, this is not a question, that is a comment, and I support this comment. And the other question on particularly vulnerable, I must say that that was the compromise that they could find in the last hours of the COP, while industrialized countries wanted to have the number of countries having access to the fund very small. They said only small island development states and least developed countries should have access. And then there were like the entire group of developing countries and said like, no, we need all developing countries having access. And then the compromise was to say, okay, those who are particularly vulnerable. And now within the year, it has to be negotiated, or indicators have to be found then to make clear in which case, under which circumstances, is a developing country actually particularly vulnerable. So I guess that is now the beginning for looking into all risk indices, risk vulnerable and risk index that are existing already related to climate change, and finding their indicators. And it is a big role for civil society organizations like us to develop these indicators and to make sure that all people who are impacted by climate change get support to get back on their feet and have actually access to this fund. It will be a dirty game now, I tell you.
Thank you, Sabine, for all your comments. And as you said, this is the fight. to define what is particularly vulnerable, to get debt, to get socioeconomic realities, to get all these structural things that are also generating vulnerability and not just a take on climate hazards only. So now I'm going to switch to Spanish to say the closing. And so, muchas gracias, Sabine, por todo. Queremos extenderles el agradecimiento a todas y todas por habernos acompañado. Les recordamos que el próximo taller, la próxima charla será el 25 de abril a las 8 horas de Centroamérica, eso es -6 GMT. Y estaremos hablando sobre el Comité de Transición de Daños y Pérdidas, que está a cargo de Ángela Rivera, bueno, que va a estar a cargo en la mitad del año por Ángela Rivera, que es negociadora de daños y pérdidas en Colombia. Ángela fue una de las voces más fuertes para Latinoamérica en la COP27, involucrada en esta lucha por el fondo. También les invitamos a conocer sobre nuestras investigaciones en la Ruta del Clima y también de nuestros socios que están apoyando estos talleres. Pueden visitar nuestra página web, larutadelclima.org, y pues tengan un excelente día o tarde donde quiera que estén. Hasta luego. Thank you, Sabine. Have a good day. Bye.
Adiós.